Story number 1. I used to think nothing in this world could truly unsettle me. Until I saw that thing rise out of the river like it had no business being on a land. They say the land didn't just die. It was emptied, like something had drained the life out of it on purpose. The kind of place you'd drive past and feel colder just from the sight of it. People pretend it doesn't exist. They skip that road, change the subject, and bury the name in silence. But I can't forget it. Not after what Billy told me. The night Billy returned to town, he didn't bring booze, laughter, or another one of his tales. He brought silence. A silence so thick you could taste it. And when we found his tackle box after he died, what we discovered wasn't just scribbled warnings. It was a map no one dared follow. There's this place in the countryside where I live. I wish I could remember the name. It might have been something like Obligini, though I've never been able to find it on a map. Still, it's real, and people around here talk about it sometimes in a way that makes it sound like it should have just vanished off the face of the earth. The place isn't a town exactly, more like a patch of land, whatever it is, though everything there is dead. And I don't mean like abandoned. I mean nothing lives there. No wildlife at any rate. No fish in the water, no bugs, no frogs, no rabbits. It's eerie and weird. See, there's this body of water there too. Not quite a lake, but bigger than a pond. Locals said it used to be full of life decades ago. You know, like bass, perch, the usual. But for years now, it's just water. No ripples, no reflection, just water that seems to hold a grudge. I'd only ever been out there once as a kid. My uncle took me fishing, but the place gave him such a bad feeling that he packed up our gear 5 minutes after we got there. He never explained why. But Billy used to fish further upstream. He didn't believe in ghost stories or cursed land. Or maybe he just didn't care. Loneliness does strange things to a man. What he saw that night broke something inside him. And that was before the nightmares started. Billy wasn't exactly known for his credibility. Most people called him the town drunk. Nice guy, mostly. He'd talk your ear off at the gas station if you let him, usually about fish he never caught or wars he never fought in. But that night, he was different. But what I do remember clearly is what happened to a guy who used to live near that area known as Billy. He was what most people in the town would call the town drunk, friendly, mostly harmless, and usually seen stumbling around the gas station looking for beer and conversation. No one ever took him seriously. He wasn't educated. Most days, he could barely string a sentence together without slurring. But one night, Billy came back into town looking like he'd seen the gates of hell. I was at the diner. Just coffee, no crowd. He walked in, knees soaked, hands trembling, and eyes stuck to the floor like gravity had given up on everything else but him. His boots left muddy water prints on the tile, but the waitress didn't even scold him. That's how strange the air felt. He sat down at the counter, didn't order anything, didn't even look up. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear, too clear, like it had come from someone else. He said he'd gone out to fish just past dusk there, about half a mile upstream from the dead zone. Said it was peaceful at first, but something felt wrong. Too quiet, he told me. Not just no birds or frogs. I couldn't even hear my own breathing. Then came the splash, Schrute said. At first, he thought it was a deer or maybe a wild pig, but then he saw it maybe 30 feet downstream. Something was crawling down the opposite bank. It looked like a pig, he said. Same low body, same bulk, but something was different. It didn't move like a pig. Its joints bent weird. Its back hunched and swayed in a way that didn't seem right. It moved like it had worn out the body it was using, like it remembered how to crawl, but forgot why. Billy said it entered the water noiselessly, as if the river itself obeyed its presence. No resistance, no kick. It swam with perfect control, like it had done it every night for 100 years. And then when it got to the other side, it did something Billy couldn't explain. It stood on its back legs like a man. He said it rose to its feet slowly, like limbs unfolding from the hunched shape. Its back straightened, and its arms dropped down to its sides. It didn't look like a pig anymore, not even close. It was tall and wiry, and it walked out the river like it had done it 1,000 times. Billy told me it didn't acknowledge him at all, just walked into the trees. He was paralyzed. He said it felt like every bone in his body had turned to ice. Only when his cigarette burnt down to his skin did he move again. He left everything behind, rod, box, bait, and walked back in the dark. He wouldn't go back after that, wouldn't even drive near that part of town. I once tried bringing it up over a smoke behind the store. He got real quiet. He said, "It's not the place, you know. It's what watches from under it." He believed something lived there, not in the trees, not even in the soil, but in the water itself, like the whole river had become one breathing thing with 1,000 eyes just beneath the surface. People didn't believe him, obviously. Some laughed it off. Others said he was finally losing it. But I remember the look on his face, the way his voice dropped when he described the thing standing up in the river. Billy died a few years later, alone in a trailer on the edge of town. The landlord found him 2 days after he passed. We went to clean up his things. His fridge was empty. His bed was unmade, but inside his old tackle box were scraps of yellow paper, damp and curling at the edges. Each one said the same thing: "There's something in the water." And from that day on, no one ever fished that river again. It did. Years passed after Billy died. Most folks forgot, or pretended to, but not me. I kept thinking about those words scrawled in his tackle box: "There's something in the water." That wasn't a drunken man's nonsense. That was a warning. I started reading, digging through archived newspapers, old county maps, and every fishing log I could get my hands on. Strangely enough, the area Billy fished wasn't marked on any official map, but I found references, brief ones, in survey reports from decades ago. References to soil erosion, livestock vanishing, water imbalance. There was one phrase that kept popping up: Zone D, access suspended indefinitely. I drove out there one cloudy morning. I knew the road by feel more than memory. The trees grew thicker than I remembered, like they were trying to reclaim something. No birds, no wind, just the heavy weight of air. I parked a good half-mile from the old riverbank, brought my camera, a notebook, and a voice recorder. It felt stupid, like I was chasing the ghost of a drunk. but I wasn't ready for what I found. The water hadn't moved in years. It looked the same as in Billy's story, motionless, dark, like glass stretched too thin. I didn't dare step closer at first, just stood on the slope, scanning the tree line. The branches on the far side hung too low, like something tall had passed beneath them often. I turned on the recorder and started speaking. July Port, 11:42 a.m. No signs of life. Air is humid. Water, dense. That's when I saw it. Not a creature. Not movement, but footprints. Long, deep-set tracks led up from the river and into the woods. Prints, unlike anything I'd seen. They weren't hooves, not paws. Almost human, but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too flat, as if it had evolved out of shape, adapting to both land and water. The strangest part? The tracks looked recent, still damp. I should have turned around. Every instinct told me to, but something pulled me forward. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Trees bent in unnatural arches above me, roots split and curled like they'd been pushed aside repeatedly. About 20 minutes in, I found it a clearing. In the center stood a shack, rotted, caved in on one side, but not empty. It was Billy's. Somehow it had been moved here, or rebuilt, or never left. Inside was his old thermos, half-melted radio, and nailed to the wall a map made of stitched-together paper. Each dot marked a place he'd seen it. Each line traced its path. The words scrawled in red ink repeated, "It swims, it walks, it waits." Suddenly, I heard it, a soft rustle behind me, slow, deliberate, not wind. I froze. I didn't turn around. Not at first. I thought if I stayed still, it wouldn't see me. But then I felt it. The ground shifted. The soil beneath my boots pulsed like a heartbeat deep underground, the same rhythm I'd felt in my chest. The river wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Whatever lived there, it wasn't alone. The land, the water, even the air, it was all part of it. I turned slowly and saw nothing. But the footprints were fresh again, leading back toward the water. I didn't run. I walked, step by step, backward, never turning my back. The forest watched me. I felt it pressing in. When I finally reached my truck, there were claw marks on the driver's side door. I left town that night. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't want to be laughed at like Billy. But weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff. They'd found another body near the river, someone passing through. Backpacker. Journal filled with entries about dreams he couldn't explain. Nightmares of something watching him from beneath the surface. His last words, "The water remembers me." Oh, I never went back. But I know one day I'll have to, because last night I dreamed of Billy again. He was standing in the river, only this time he wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at me. Story number 2. People say kids make things up. But what if the scariest thing you ever saw happened when you were so young that no one believed you? I was just 4 years old when it happened, and to this day, I still don't know if I stumbled into something supernatural, alien, or something far older than either. It's been years since that summer, but the memory hasn't dimmed. In fact, it seems to have sharpened with time, like it wants me to remember. The memory didn't blur like others from my childhood. It stayed razor sharp, rooted deep in my bones, like it never wanted to leave. That summer, my grandmother and I spent a lot of time outside. She had a stretch of land down in south central Arkansas, not far from the Louisiana border, a few woods, a mostly dry creek, and a big open pasture in the back where sunlight never felt gentle. She was a no-nonsense kind of woman, always had a dish towel over one shoulder and a broom in hand, never talked about ghosts or spirits or anything she couldn't explain with weather or stubbornness. She was my anchor, the most solid thing in my tiny world. I never told the full story until now, because the one person who was with me, my grandma, refused to ever speak of it again. That day we packed up for a picnic, just the two of us and her dog. The dog was one of those mutts you couldn't name the breed of, sandy color, quiet, moved like it knew how to listen. It never barked unless something truly wasn't right. We walked across the field, cutting through the creek bed, dry as chalk, and made our way toward the back pasture. There was a lone cedar tree that stood apart from the rest. Not quite in the woods, not quite in the open. Just there, sentinel-like, watching over the land. Grandma always called it her favorite tree. There's a tree in Arkansas that I haven't seen in decades, but I can still feel its bark against my back, the way it sheltered us that day. We laid out a blanket under the cedar and started on our sandwiches. I was eating mine crust first like a weirdo when the dog stood up. Just like that, stiff-legged, tail low, ears sharp, and then it barked. She began barking loudly and aggressively, full-on growling, hackles up, spinning in frantic circles around us. That dog, she never did that, not once in her whole life. Grandma froze. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't speak at all. Just grabbed my arm and started cleaning up the food with one hand like something was chasing us already. That's when I looked up, and then there was the thing, that gray thing. It wasn't there, and then it was. And once you see something like that, you stop feeling safe in the daylight. About 50 yards away near the edge of the trees, something stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't there, and then it was. That's the best way I can explain it. It didn't make a sound. No twigs snapping, no rustling leaves. It was as if it had been stitched into the world in one instant. Something gray, tall, way too tall to be a man, and broad. It stood on two legs like it belonged here, but its arms hung too low, too long, and its skin, or whatever was covering it, looked dull and matte, like stone covered in dust. My grandma didn't say a word. She just scooped me up with both arms and bolted. She grabbed me, yanked me up into her arms, and bolted. Our dog tore off beside us. She just wanted to get away. You'd think she'd run back toward the house, but she didn't. That would have meant crossing open land with nowhere to hide. Instead, she turned toward the cedar tree like it was a fortress. I could hear her breath in my ear. No panic, just hard, fast determination. I could feel her heartbeat where my cheek pressed against her chest. She never spoke, but I knew. She was terrified. When we reached the tree, she finally let me down. The dog stopped barking. She sat right beside us, eyes on the woods, but calm now. And that was the strangest thing. The feeling of calm that washed over all of us. Not because the danger was gone, but because the tree had done something. The tree felt ancient, protective, like it remembered things long before we were born. We sat there for what had felt like an hour. My grandma clutched the edge of her basket like it was a weapon, staring out across the field. But the thing never came closer. It just stood there and watched. Eventually, we walked back. No one spoke. I don't even remember if we looked back. We never talked about it, not once. Years best, and the memory refused to die. Every now and then, I'd ask Grandma about the cedar tree, and she'd get this look. Not fear exactly, more like reverence. Like people talk about churches or grave sites. Once, when I was maybe 11, I asked her straight out, what was that thing we saw? She didn't blink, just said, "You dreamed that," and walked away. But she wasn't lying. She was protecting something. I could hear it in her tone, the way her voice clipped that final word like it was sealing a door. My grandma mentioned the cedar tree a few times since, always with this reverent tone. But she's ever once brought up what happened that day. The dog lived to be 14. Never barked like that again. Never showed fear. Not even during thunderstorms or when strangers came by. Whatever she saw that day broke something inside her, or maybe opened something that she kept tightly shut after. Over the years, I heard stories. People talked about Bigfoot, or strange men in ghillie suits, or tricks of light making deer look upright. But none of those fit. This thing didn't feel like a creature. It felt like a presence, like it knew we were there and simply didn't care. That's what haunts me the most. The indifference. It didn't chase us. It didn't roar or charge. It just watched, fully aware, as if to say, "You saw me. That's enough." I tried to forget. Went off to college. Moved to the city. Married. Had kids. Life moved on like it does, dragging you forward with deadlines and mortgages. But sometimes at night, I'd dream of the cedar tree. I'd feel the bark against my back, smell the air thick with sap and heat, and I'd feel that cold awareness pressing from the tree line. Once, I went back. It was 10 years ago. I parked by the old gravel road and hiked out to the pasture. The house was long gone, burned in a storm the year after Grandma passed, but the tree still there, bigger, somehow, taller, or maybe just the way memory made it grow. I stood at its base for hours, said nothing, didn't move, and just for a moment, I felt watched. I wasn't afraid, just aware. Some places hold echoes, and some echoes remember you back. When I stood under that cedar tree again after all those years, I noticed something strange, something that hadn't been there before. A ring of small, flat stones circled the base, half buried in the dirt. They looked ordinary enough, weathered and lichen-covered, but they felt deliberate. I couldn't say why. It was the kind of knowing that lived in your skin, not your mind. I didn't dare step inside the ring, so I sat just beyond it and closed my eyes. My breath steadied. The wind didn't blow, but the leaves above rustled anyway, as if stirred by something that wasn't wind at all. That feeling returned, the one I hadn't known since I was 4. Not fear, not quite, just the sense that something old was paying attention. I placed my palm flat on the earth and felt warmth. And then I heard it, not words, not sound, but knowing, something like, "You remember me?" I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood, the ring of stones looked cleaner, like the dirt had shifted. I was almost sure some of the moss had vanished. I left in silence, didn't even glance at the tree as I walked away. That was the last time I visited. But I started dreaming again. This time, they were different. I'd find myself standing in a forest, not unlike the one behind my grandmother's pasture, only the trees were wrong, too tall, too smooth, their bark black and glistening like obsidian. The cedar tree was always there, impossibly large, towering into darkness above, and standing beneath it, the gray figure, not moving, just waiting. 2 years ago, I received a letter. No return address. Just my name and a wax seal stamped with the imprint of a cedar bough. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Did you see it again? No signature, no explanation. But I knew exactly what it meant. I began researching. Not on the internet. This wasn't something Google could help with. I went to university archives, folklore collections, old newspaper clippings from rural Arkansas counties. Most of it was useless, hoaxes, tall tales. But I kept going, and eventually I found a journal entry dated 9/3. Something gray came out of the pines. We lost our goats. The dogs ran and didn't come back for days. But it wasn't the thing itself that scared us. It was what it left behind. The silence. Like the woods held its breath. Like they remembered it. A second entry, decades later in 1944, from a local farmer's diary. "The cedar on the hill is blooming too early again, short. They say don't touch it. My boy went missing near there once. Came back fine, but won't talk. Not a word in 2 weeks, just stares. Like he's watching something none of us can see. That boy was never named." But I wondered, how many people had seen it? How many were told it was just a dream? I came across maps with notes scrawled in the margins. Thin place, veil weak here. Circle, never broken, always near cedar groves. Always near old land with long memories. I wasn't alone, and then the dreams changed again. Now, I wasn't just watching the gray figure. I was standing with it, side by side beneath that impossible tree. It never turned to face me, but I knew it knew I was there. One night, I heard a voice, not a dream, a real voice, in my own living room as I sat in the dark. "You are the last to remember." Ooh. I turned every light on in the house, slept with the radio on. But the words repeated in my head. "You are the last to." So now I write this, not because I want anyone to believe me. I know most won't. That's not the point. I write it because maybe someone else has seen it. Maybe someone else has stood in that same field, under a tree that doesn't belong, and felt that silence pressing in. Maybe you dreamed of a gray shape and thought you were just a frightened kid. Maybe you weren't. 3 months after I received the letter, I got another. This time, it contained a map. No words, no markings. Just a charcoal sketch of a forested hill, a small circle drawn where the cedar tree should have been, and one note: not alone anymore. I don't know what made me go back again. Maybe I was chasing closure. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that this hadn't all just been an overgrown childhood nightmare. Maybe I just wanted to see it again. I packed a flashlight, compass, and a journal. I didn't plan on staying overnight, but some part of me knew I would. I drove to the edge of the county, then hiked on foot to the pasture. The land had changed. Fences gone, creek overgrown, but the tree still stood, right where the map had marked it. It was darker beneath the cedar than it should have been. I sat in the dirt just outside the stone circle and waited. As the sun dipped, a heavy quiet pressed in. The kind of silence that eats sound. No birds, no insects, just the thick hum of stillness. The light shifted, though the sky above remained clear. A grayness settled, not fog, not shadow, but something else. A hush, older than time. And then I saw movement near the tree line. It wasn't the gray thing, not at first. It was someone else. A man, or maybe a woman, standing stiffly at the edge of the woods, arms at their sides. They didn't move like a person should. Too smooth, too patient. Then another, and another. 3, then 5. They stood evenly spaced, facing the cedar. Not me, not the field, just the tree. I didn't speak, didn't move. I don't know why I wasn't afraid. When I looked back toward the cedar, it was there. The gray thing, just as before. But this time, it wasn't watching me. It stood at the very center of the circle, taller than I remembered, arms slightly raised. The others didn't react. They just stood, waiting, and then I understood. It wasn't a monster. It was a guardian of what? The veil, the space between here and something else, something worse. And the cedar wasn't just a tree, it was a lock. I watched as the gray figure slowly lowered its arms. The watchers at the tree line turned in unison and walked backward into the woods. One gone. The gray thing turned, just slightly, its featureless head angling toward me, not threatening, not angry, just aware. I whispered aloud, "Thank you." Then it was gone. I returned home and didn't speak a word to anyone. Not my wife, not my kids. Some truths live too deep to be shared casually. But I kept the journal, wrote every detail I could remember, sights, sounds, feelings, everything. I drew the map again, added notes, dates, even taped the original letters inside. I locked it in a box beneath my bed, sealed in cloth that smelled faintly of cedar. Weeks passed. The dreams heated. The voice never returned. But I knew something had changed. Not out there, in me. I began seeing echoes of it in the world. In the way trees leaned slightly inward during hikes. In the hush before thunderstorms. In the way dogs sometimes stared at corners like they remembered a rule they couldn't explain. Once, while walking downtown, I passed an old man leaning against a bus stop pole. He looked up as I walked by and nodded. slow and heavy, like he knew me, like he knew what I'd seen. I nodded back. No words. Didn't need any. They say some people are born near a thin place, where reality frays and overlaps with things we're not supposed to see. I think I was one of them. And I think that cedar tree was the stitching. A year after my final visit, I received one last package. No return address. Inside was a photograph, sepia-toned and blurry. It showed the cedar tree from decades ago, maybe the 1920s. In front of it stood a woman holding a child, and beside them, faint, almost invisible, a tall gray blur at the tree's edge. On the back, in handwriting that looked suspiciously like my grandmother's, were 4 words: "Let the tree stand." I never learned who sent it, but I know what it meant. So I'm writing this now for whoever needs it. Maybe you're a child who saw something strange and was told it was a dream. Maybe you have a dog who growled once at something you couldn't see. Maybe you've stood under a cedar tree and felt the air tighten around you like a held breath. If so, you're not alone. There are guardians among us, not good, not evil, just necessary. They don't need worship. They don't want thanks. They want the tree to stand, because the day it falls, we all see what's on the other side. The cedar tree still stands. I checked last week. It drove out at dawn before the world had fully woken, walked the same trail I once ran down clutched in my grandmother's arms. The land has changed, grown wilder, lonelier, but the tree endures, taller than before, broader too, a monument without plaque or prayer. I stood there in silence, just like I did all those years ago, and I whispered, "I remember." A breeze stirred the branches. It didn't answer, not in any way a person would recognize, but I felt it again, that old understanding, the hush, the calm, the vigilance. I placed a hand against its bark and made a promise. I won't let them cut you down, not while I still draw breath, because I finally understand now. You're not holding something out. You're holding something in. And that thing, it remembers us too, Ja. Story number 3. They say dreams aren't real. But how do you explain 2 people dreaming the same nightmare, in the same place, with the same monster watching through your eyes? You think nightmares vanish when you wake up. Mine just paused, waiting. And one night, it woke up with my father too. In my dream, I wasn't just being hunted, I was being seen. Not from the outside, but from the inside. What if your childhood home wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by something that learned to live inside your thoughts? When my dad turned pale and whispered, "Did it happen in the East St. Paul house?" I felt something ancient open its eyes again. For most of my childhood and early teen years, I had this recurring nightmare. It was always the same. There was this thing, this creature, that I could only ever describe as a lizard man. Though even that doesn't fully explain how disturbing it was. It was tall and thin and mottled, scaly skin that shimmered just slightly. Its eyes were huge and glassy, with vertical slits that glowed faintly. The worst part was that it could see through my eyes. Not metaphorically, but literally. In the dream, I'd always be hiding from it somewhere, sometimes in the basement, sometimes wedged into a closet, and sometimes under a bed. It didn't know where I was at first, and I could almost feel its confusion as it wandered into the halls and roamed the outside of the house, looking for me. But the second I peeked out just to check if I was safe, if I so much as cracked the closet door to look through the blinds, it knew exactly where I was, because then it would come see what I was seeing. It would instantly turn its head in my direction and start coming for me. I'd panic, tearing out of my hiding spot and run to a new one. And the cycle would continue. What terrified me wasn't that it chased me. It was the intelligence behind it. Like it wasn't acting out of instinct. It was thinking, waiting, letting me make the first move, then punishing me for it. The creature never made a sound. It just knew. The moment my fear crept into curiosity and I dared to look, it would look back through my own vision. It wasn't hunting my body. It was hunting my awareness. There were nights I tried staying absolutely still. I'd tuck myself so deep into the shadows of a dream closet that even breathing felt like betrayal. But it always waited, and I always cracked. The house in my dream was always the same. A narrow kitchen, a sagging wooden fence, a cold basement with chipped concrete and exposed rafters. Back then, I thought those were just random dream details, background noise. But I was wrong. Years later, I sat across from my bed over Earl's coffee. We were just talking about weird dreams and sleepwalking. I laughed. Yeah, I used to have this dream about a lizard guy who could see through my eyes. It was like hide and seek, but he'd always win if I looked. My dad didn't laugh. Oh, he stopped mid-sip, lowered his mug, and stared at me like I had just read out his autopsy report. His knuckles turned white around the handle. Then he asked quietly, "Did it happen in our old place in East Paul? The one with the row of apartments behind it?" I froze. My brain flipped like a light switch in a dark basement. "Yeah," I said. That's where I'd always end up hiding. Basement, laundry room, sometimes out by the fence, always that house. Then he whispered, "Because I have the exact same dream." We sat in silence, the kind of silence that pushes your skin cold and makes shadows seem louder. Then he told me the details, the hiding spots, the creature, the basement with the exposed rafters, the way it only found him when he looked out. And then something hit me I had never described to that house to him. I'd never told anyone about this dream before. It was exact. Every beam, every corner, every panic breath we shared in our own heads. That night changed how I remembered that house. I'd always felt uneasy in it as a kid, avoided certain rooms, refused to go into the basement unless someone was with me. Thought I was just a scared little boy. But maybe I wasn't wrong. Neither of us had the dream before moving there. And after we moved, it faded. The lizard man didn't follow. It stayed. I had it maybe once or twice after we left, usually on nights when the power was out or when I felt watched. But nothing like before. My dad said the same, like it was bound to that house, or maybe to that part of our lives. But once, he told me something else. He said he tried staying perfectly hidden, never peeking, never giving the creature a reason to know where he was. And it worked at first. The lizard man didn't move, didn't search. It just stood there, waiting, like a statue of intent. He said it wasn't confused, it was patient. Eventually, he blinked, he moved, and it came. Years later, I visited East St. Paul again, drove past the old house. It looked smaller, peeling siding to the same leaning fence. But when I stopped the car and just stared for a while, I swear I felt it staring back. Not from the windows, from inside me. I haven't told anyone else. Not really, because I know how it works now. The dream isn't just something that visits. It's something that waits to be remembered. And once you think about it, it remembers you. Story number 4. There are nights when the sky doesn't just look dark. It feels like it's watching back. I was only a child, but that night marked the end of my innocence and the beginning of a lifelong question. It wasn't just a light. It wasn't just a craft. It was something that knew I was there. And when it realized I saw it, it left like nothing bound to earth ever could. They told me it was just a dream. But decades later, the world accidentally confirmed what I saw. I remember the color of the sky that night. Not just the way it looked, but how it felt. A deep velvet twilight had settled across our quiet neighborhood. My mom had just kissed my forehead, whispered goodnight, and left the door ajar, as she always did. My small canopy bed was pressed against the window, the gingham pattern on my sheets still warm from the dryer. It was the mid-1960s, and I was 7 years old. My dad worked the evening shift at the Chrysler plant on Shotland Avenue in Indianapolis. So, it was just me and my mom that night at home. I wasn't scared of the dark, not usually, but something in the air felt different, like the night was holding its breath. I hadn't even closed my eyes yet when I saw it, a shimmering shape drifting down from the sky. It wasn't shaped like a saucer or anything I'd ever seen in cartoons. It looked almost clear, as though someone had carved a toy from ice and set it spinning in midair. Red, blue, and green lights blinked in perfect rhythm across its translucent surface. It descended slowly, deliberately. No sound, no wind. Descending from the sky was a strange see-through craft spinning very fast. But it had no blades, propellers, or rotors. Even as a child, I knew how planes and helicopters worked. But this was different. I pressed my face to the window, watching in silent awe. The craft hovered not 20 feet from my window, turning slowly like a giant ornament floating in the air. Its surface caught the fading twilight, and for a second, I wondered if I was dreaming. But I knew I wasn't. It spun rapidly, pulsing with alternating red, blue, and green lights. It looked as if it were made of acrylic or glass, smooth, almost crystalline. It moved toward slowly, dropping straight down in a controlled descent before coming to a stop, hovering slantly just beyond my window. As I stared, it made a move that broke all logic. It didn't bank or tilt like a plane. Instead, It shifted perfectly sideways, like a chess piece on an invisible board, and then stopped again. Then it glided back, same precision, same grace. I remember thinking it looked like a Christmas decoration, those old lights shaped like acorns or toy spinning tops. But I also remember a feeling in my stomach, a twisting tension, like something unseen was about to reach out and touch me. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. Even then, I was a pragmatic, level-headed kid and didn't make up wild stories. I knew that what I was seeing wasn't normal. It was beautiful and impossible. And then it changed. I didn't hear it speak. It didn't flash a signal. But in one cold wave through my chest, I knew it saw me. It wasn't just passing by. It was studying me. And when it knew I knew, the craft shot straight up like a bullet, vanishing into the sky at an impossible speed. The room felt suddenly still, as if even the walls were unsure of what had just happened. I blinked, expecting to see it again, hoping maybe, but the sky was empty. I called for my mom, voice small and trembling, but she didn't answer. I wanted to tell her to run out of my room and explain what I had just seen, but a heavy realization settled over me. I'm just a little kid. No one would believe me. So I sat there, heart racing, the warmth of the blankets now replaced by a butt that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sleep never came. In the days that followed, I tried to forget. But memory doesn't always work that way. Years passed. I grew up, became the kind of adult who needed logic, explanations, things that made sense. But nothing I saw that night fit in a neat box. I never talked about it, not really. Until one night, something changed everything. I was watching a film alone, a classic, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Spielberg's work always fascinated me, but that night it was more than fascination. A scene played, air traffic controllers tracking a fast-moving object over Indianapolis. Their voices, the coordinates, the urgency. It was cinematic. Yes. But something rang too familiar. Then, about a decade ago, I was watching Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I'm a huge Steven Spielberg and Stephen King fan, and there's a scene where air traffic controllers track an unidentified object over Indianapolis. A moment inspired by real-life events at the Indianapolis International Airport. I sat up straight, my hands clenched. As I watched, the realization hit me like a tidal wave. What those pilots and air traffic controllers saw that night, it was the exact same thing I saw as a little girl. The time, the place, the description, it all lines up. That night, the world unknowingly confirmed my truth. The craft existed, just others saw it. But still, no one could answer the question that mattered most to me. Why did it stop? Why me? Even now, I sit by the window some nights, staring into the same sky. I've replayed the moment 1,000 times. The glow, the silence, the speed. Even after all these years, I still wonder what it was, and why did it seem to notice me? I've accepted I may never know, but in a way, I don't need confirmation anymore. I was there, I remember, and for one short moment, something not from here looked at me like I mattered, and that is something no one can take away. Story number 5. You don't forget the night the sky stares back at you, not with intent, not with color, not when something from above leaves a mark you never had before. They say scars tell stories. Mine whispers in silence, pulsing every time I think back to that orb floating just beyond the treetops. I wasn't looking for answers. I just wanted a quiet weekend. What I got was an encounter no one could explain. Do you see that? Those 4 words from my sister were the last normal thing I heard that night. The light moved like it was watching us. And then, when we thought it had gone, it was already behind us. You never expect something life-altering to begin with a peaceful night. That evening had no warnings, no eerie feelings, no telltale signs in the air. The house was warm, filled with the subtle hum of late-night music and the scent of old wood and cotton sheets. My sister and I were catching up in the room that used to be a sunroom. Windows stretching from wall to wall like the house was begging to be exposed. I remember looking out at the sky while lying there. The stars were out, but one of them didn't quite belong. It looked like a star, but something about it felt off. It was brighter than the rest, and instead of moving across the sky, it just hovered in place, not perfectly still, but kind of floating within the same small area. We brushed it off at first. Maybe a satellite, maybe nothing. But my sister went to the bathroom, and when she came back, her voice held something different. She stood beside the bed and looked out the window and asked, "Do you see that?" I got up and looked where she was pointing. It was the same orb I had seen before, but now it had moved across the sky and was hovering in between 2 trees. By then, my pulse had quickened. Not fear, just that subtle edge of knowing something was watching back. The light didn't flicker like a plane or sway like a lantern. It had intention. It hung there, pulsing, alive. We couldn't tear our eyes from it. I moved from window to window, trying to catch a better angle. And every time I blinked, it seemed to shift just slightly, as though it knew I was trying to find its edges. Eventually, we made the decision to step outside, not with panic, with curiosity. Like people walking toward a flame, unsure if it would warm or burn them. When we looked up again, somehow it was on the other side of the sky, still hovering and twinkling. The street was quiet, painted silver by the moon. Then the neighbor came out. He wasn't startled, just curious, like us. Almost as if the light had summoned him too. We asked him if he saw it. He said he had, and even went back inside to grab binoculars for us. Looking through the lenses didn't give answers. It gave more questions. The orb didn't have a shape, only radiance, cycling between red, green, and white like it couldn't decide what it was. Was it scanning, observing, communicating? Something about it felt deliberate. We stood there like that, silent observers to something beyond our world until we were too exhausted to stay awake. There was no dramatic disappearance, no explosion of speed, just a fade behind the trees and silence. The next morning felt different, and not just because of the night before. I was about to take a shower when I took off my shirt and froze. There was a mark about 3 and long, razor straight, dark, and completely healed, like an old scar. Not a scratch, not something fresh. Just I'd never had surgery. I'd never been hurt. Nothing had happened the day before that would have caused it. I touched it, cold, smooth. A perfect incision. But from where? From what? No pain, no memory. Just proof. I don't know what I saw in the sky, but I've got a scar that showed up right after and no explanation for how it got there. I asked my sister. She saw nothing on me the night before. It was as new to her as it was to me. We checked online. Dozens of people had seen the orb, described the same lights, but no one mentioned what came afterward. I still carry that scar. Faded, yes, but always there. A reminder, a warning, or maybe an invitation. And sometimes late at night, when I look up and the stars seem just a bit too still, I wonder if it's still watching. Story number 6. There's something deeply wrong about a silence that comes too suddenly. One moment, you're hearing the world, distant traffic, a faint breeze, the gentle creak of trees, and the next, it's as though existence itself hit pause. I remember that silence most, not the creature, not the tree, the silence, the kind that fills your ears like water and makes your heartbeat feel intrusive. It was my parents' front yard. Familiar, ordinary. But that night, it was a void. The kind of quiet that felt too deliberate, like something was listening back. What truly froze me wasn't the shape I saw. It was the feeling that it had seen me first. That's the part that claws its way back every time I close my eyes, the knowledge that I was not alone in the dark. And something tall and wrong was already waiting. I was coming home from a party around midnight to my parents' house. They live in a quiet neighborhood, and their house sits about 15 to 20 feet back from the road. The route was familiar, but everything felt subtly off. Mailboxes seemed shorter, shadows deeper, the entire block. I had to park near the curb, and by the time I got there, all the lights were off. My parents were evidently already asleep, and the whole place was pitch black. Even the motion sensor on the porch didn't blink. No porch light greeted me, just the silent accusation of my footsteps. As I locked up my car and started walking across the open front yard towards the door, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was an instinctive discomfort, like walking into a room moments after someone has left, but their scent still lingers. There's only one tree in the yard, a towering evergreen with thick branches that block out most of the light even during the day. But this time, it wasn't the tree that mattered. Behind the trunk of the evergreen was something tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, pale, almost bluish white, with a hazy glow, not bright, just faint enough that it stood out against the darkness. Its limbs didn't hang naturally. They were too long, and their stillness was too intentional. It had a human-like shape, but its proportions were off. It was rail-thin, with ridiculously long arms and legs, and even longer fingers. The fingers reached almost to its knees. They dangled, limp yet full of tension. No face or real features, just this elongated, vaguely humanoid figure. Still, I felt watched. I knew it was facing me. I didn't need eyes to confirm it. I raised my keys defensively without realizing the way a child holds up a toy sword to a monster they can't name. Then motion, subtle but horrifying. That's when its head started moving, not turning slowly, but twitching side to side. There was no rhythm to the jerks, just raw dissonance, like a corrupted video clip looping incorrectly. Then its body followed suit, chewed. It took 3 long strides from behind the tree straight towards the side of the house, and it moved with a certain wrongness, like something you'd see if you pulled a rubber band tight and then let it snap. It crossed the yard in what should have been 3 seconds, but it did it in less than 1. It didn't blur or vanish. It stretched through the air and shot around the back of the house like it was gliding way too fast for a human. No trace, no trail, like watching a shadow get sucked backward into the ground. I stood there for maybe half a minute, frozen. Then the upstairs curtain shifted ever so slightly. I broke. By the time I got myself moving and ran inside, it was gone. But there was no sound, no trace that it had even been there. Inside was no safer. The dark followed me in. I turned on lights compulsively, but immediately regretted it. Now it could see me too, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, especially from the windows. Every reflective surface in that house made my skin crawl. Mirrors, glass cabinets, even the sheen on polished wood, they all shimmered like water, waiting for a ripple. I tried shutting every curtains, but I knew it didn't matter. I didn't sleep much that night. I just lay in bed trying to convince myself it was some kind of costume, a prank or a trick of the light. But I knew it wasn't. I sat up for hours, pacing, writing out explanations I'd never use. Projection mapping prank was my favorite. Eventually, I passed out from exhaustion, curled into a fetal position on the couch. In the morning, everything looked normal again. Tree, grass, porch, but the silence had left something behind. I never found footprints, not a single blade of grass out of place. But I also never looked too hard. I didn't want proof. Years later, my parents asked why I never came home for Halloween. I lied and said I hated the holiday. But the truth is, I still don't know what that thing was. I only know it waited for me. And somehow, deep down, I know it wasn't the first time. Story number 7. Have you ever stood in a place so familiar it felt like a dream? Until something tore through the fabric of reality right in front of you? I wasn't supposed to see what I saw that night, but I did. And now I can never unsee it. They moved with purpose, inhumanly silent, as if they had done this 100 times before. I thought I was just visiting my girlfriend for dinner. What I witnessed shattered everything I believed about the world. This isn't just a story. It's a memory I relive every time I close my eyes. And it still makes my chest tighten, like I'm back in that hallway, frozen. You never expect reality to fray at the edges inside a kitchen. But that's exactly where my world tore in two. I was visiting my girlfriend that night, just like dozens of times before. The air had that sleepy heaviness of a late evening, tea murmuring in the background, someone's leftovers still warm in the oven, and the feeling that the night had already made up its mind to be uneventful. Her house was always quiet in a way that made you lower your voice without knowing why. Dinner had gone fine. Her little sister giggled through most of it, her grandmother nodded along to the conversation, and her mom mostly stayed glued to her wine glass. Afterward, my girlfriend and I retreated to her room, where we talked about nothing, curled up like kids, and planned the weekend. Hours had passed. Eventually, I checked the clock, rubbed my face, and realized I needed to get home if I wanted to function the next day. I got up, slipped into my jacket, and whispered a goodbye. I didn't know that was the last normal moment I'd ever have. The hallway was long, narrow, and oddly cold. As I approached the kitchen, something made me pause at the doorway. It wasn't a sound, nor a shadow. It was the absence of noise, so total. It felt like a vacuum had swallowed up all sound. And there, standing between the refrigerator and the front of the house, there were two creatures in front of me, leading her little sister toward the front door. I should have screamed. I should have lunged. But all I did was stare. They were maybe 4 feet tall, thin as hell, with long, skinny arms and weirdly long necks. They moved like they were used to doing this, silent and coordinated, and were wearing what appeared to be black, skin-tight suits with no zippers, no seams, just smooth and tight over their whole bodies. My body felt frozen, but not in a paralyzed way. More like my mind had disconnected the controls, leaving me there to witness something not meant for human eyes. Their heads were the size of melons, tilted slightly forward, like they didn't need to look up to know where they were going. A low hum filled the room, not through sound, but through feeling, like pressure in the ears or thoughts brushing against your own. Then something stepped out behind them. Not walked, stepped, like a stage actor hitting their cue. It stood taller than any human I've ever met. Its arms were hidden beneath a heavy-looking hooded garment, yet somehow I knew they were clawed, capable of things I didn't want to imagine. Its skin looked aged, cracked like old leather left too long in the sun. I swear to God, this thing looked like a lizard in a hooded robe. Its face was brown and leathery and scaled. It didn't blink, but looked right at me as it passed, but I couldn't read its expression. No mouth moved, but I felt a thought in my head, clear as my own. You were not supposed to see this. I wanted to step forward or scream or throw something, anything to break the spell, but I couldn't. Not because I was afraid, though I couldn't move because something outside of me decided I wouldn't. The three of them, with her little sister in the middle, walked like she was in a trance. Went straight through the front wall of the house, like they weren't even solid. No door open, no wall cracked. They just left. Time stopped. My knees buckled, but I never hit the floor. At least, I don't remember falling. I remember nothing at all until I woke up in my girlfriend's bed hours later, still fully dressed. The sunlight bleeding through the curtains didn't feel real. Everything around me had that cold glow of a dream's leftovers. But then it all came flooding back. Everything hit me at once. I remembered every single detail like it had just happened. How they moved, the look of their skin, the shape of their bodies. I could feel the fear in my chest like a weight, and I shut up and told my girlfriend everything right away. She listened, just listened. When I finished, she didn't laugh or try to explain it away. "I know," she said. "Is it?" And then she told me about the family secret, about how this had been happening since she was little, about the father who couldn't cope with it and left, about nights she would wake up with bruises in patterns she didn't understand, or dreams of being led down to hallways made of light. That same day, her mom got a call from the neighbor, a woman who had woken up in the middle of the night and seen something in their yard. When they checked, her sister was found naked and unconscious in the front yard with no memory of how she got there. No police report, no hospital visit, just whispered instructions and a quiet return to bed. From that night on, the house shifted. Boy, at first, it was small things, flickering lights, static on the television, clocks resetting themselves. Then her sister began sleepwalking. At least we called it sleepwalking. I wasn't so sure. Sometimes she would vanish from her bed, only to be found in the attic or curled under the kitchen sink. Strange sounds, lights flickering. Her sister began sleepwalking more. Sometimes I'd wake to find her standing perfectly still, staring at a wall. Once, I asked her what she was doing. She didn't even blink, just said, "The door's not open yet." There was no door. We stayed together for another year, and the house only got stranger. One night, I caught a glimpse of something skitter across the hallway ceiling. Another time, the television showed a live feed of the living room while we were all outside. I never saw those three beings again, not fully, but sometimes when I stood in the right place at the wrong time, I'd catch a shimmer in the air, a silhouette that vanished when I blinked. Eventually, I left. I couldn't take it. I wish I had stayed, or maybe I'm glad I didn't. I still don't know which. We lost contact years later, but word reached me through mutual friends. Her grandmother passed. Her mother started talking to shadows, and her sister? No one knew for sure. She left home early, moved out of state, and never answered calls. And I know how this sounds, and I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I did, and I still remember exactly how it felt, too. Standing there, completely frozen. More three inhuman things walked a little girl through a wall like it meant nothing. That moment never left me. It's been years, and I still lock my doors at night. Not because I think it'll stop them, but because if they come back, I want to at least hear them first. You don't walk away from something like that unchanged. For years, I tried to live normally, moved out, got a job in another town. I even tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a stress-induced hallucination from a sleepless night and too much leftover lasagna. But no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, the image never faded. The feeling never dulled. It sat like an old scar, just under the skin, invisible but impossible to forget. Some nights I'd wake up at 3 a.m. Always the same time, heart racing, certain someone or something had been in my room. The air would feel thick, electric, like it was waiting for something. I started leaving salt under the windows and a Bible on the nightstand, not because I was religious, but because it felt like armor. One evening, while organizing some old boxes, I found a photo I didn't recognize. It was a picture of a door that didn't exist, a wooden one, round at the top, like something out of a hobbit house. In the picture, it was etched into the living room wall of my old girlfriend's house. I knew that wall. It had been flat, blank, painted yellow with a crack running near the baseboard. But in this photo, the wall had a door, and standing next to it was her little sister, eyes closed. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but I reached out anyway. The number didn't work, so I drove. Just like that. Packed a bag, left a note at work, and drove back to that town I'd promised myself I'd never see again. Her house looked the same, that sagging roofline, the weeping oak out front, and the peeling white paint that gave the place its haunted character, but it felt still, not peaceful, stagnant, like everything had stopped and no one had told the clocks. A for sale sign leaned half buried in the overgrown yard. The blinds in every window were drawn. I parked across the street and sat there until the sky turned orange. That's when the lights turned on, only for a second. In the upstairs room, I crossed the street before my fear could talk me out of it. But the front door was unlocked. Inside, everything smelled the same: wood polish, dust, something faintly sweet and sour like spoiled fruit. The dining room table was still there, covered in a thin white sheet. A single spoon sat on top of it. The hallway to the kitchen hadn't changed. I walked it like a man retracing the steps to his own grave. And there, in the kitchen, I saw it again. That shimmer in the air, the shape of something that shouldn't be, but somehow was. But this time, I moved. I walked toward it. I was reaching out my hand, and for a moment, I felt the same cold pressure from all those years ago. A presence, a decision not mine. But this time, I pushed back. The kitchen faded, not like a light dimming, but like I was being moved, pulled sideways through a thought. And then I was somewhere else. It looked like the house, but not quite. Sharper, cleaner, wrong in the way a shadow is wrong when you realize it doesn't match the shape of the thing casting it. The hallway stretched longer. The walls hummed with unseen voices, and at the far end stood the same three figures. Only this time, the little girl in the middle wasn't my girlfriend's sister. It was me, or rather, a version of me. Mouth open, eyes vacant, walking step for step with the creatures, my legs trembled as I watched. Then the tall robed being turned toward me. Not the dream, not the memory, me. And it spoke, not aloud, not in words, but directly into my mind. We remember you. You were not meant to see. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask why me. But the words dissolved in my throat. Then I heard another voice, softer, from behind me. You never left, G. I spun around. It was her, my old girlfriend. Older now, wearing the same clothes from that night so long ago. She looked tired. They feed on the moments we don't remember, she said. You remembered. So they waited. The walls began to pulse, as if alive. I could feel my memory being pulled at, unraveling like thread. You have to go, she said. While you still know who you are, I ran, not because I was brave, but because the part of me that still knew my name told me to run. The hallway stretched and folded behind me. My lungs ached. The creatures didn't follow, but they didn't need to. I knew they could find me anytime they wanted. I dove through the shimmer and slammed back into reality, onto the cold kitchen floor. The lights flickered. A clock blinked 3 a.m. I lay there, shaking, until dawn. Oh, I haven't returned to that house since, but sometimes when I wake up too suddenly, I swear I hear a voice in the walls whispering my name, not in menace, in remembrance, because I remember, and that's the one thing they can't take back. Weeks passed, then months, but I never really left that place. After my return from the house, I became obsessed with finding answers. I tore through books on folklore, alien abductions, sleep paralysis, interdimensional theories, anything that could make sense of what I'd seen, but none of it explained the shimmer in the kitchen wall. None of it told me why I saw myself walking with them, and none of it explained why I felt like something had followed me back. The symptoms worsened. Lights in my apartment would flicker exactly at 3 a.m., never a minute before or after. Sometimes the furniture would shift slightly overnight. The couch facing the wrong direction, a lamp turning toward the wall like it was hiding. I set up cameras. Most nights, they caught nothing but static. But one night, they caught movement. 3 shadowy forms gliding across my living room. No doors opened, no windows were touched. And yet, there they were. I moved out the next morning, but it didn't help. Whatever tethered me to them wasn't tied to the house. It was inside me, in my memory. That moment, I saw what I wasn't supposed to see. That was the crack they used to crawl through. So I stopped sleeping. I stopped working. And eventually, I stopped trying to forget. It was the night of the winter solstice when I decided to try something new. I lit every candle I owned and placed them in a circle around my bedroom. I opened every door and every window. I didn't pray. I didn't plead. I just stood in the center of the room and whispered, "I see you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flame of each candle bent, not out, but inward, toward me. The air thickened, the room darkened, and the shimmer returned. Right there in front of me. No kitchen, no house, just me and them. The 3 beings emerged first, still wearing those tight black suits, their heads tilted low like obedient servants. Then came the tall one, its hood drawn, face unchanged, timeless. And then someone else stepped forward. It was the little girl, my girlfriend's sister, but older now. She looked at me like she'd been waiting. "You're the only one who didn't forget," she said. "They couldn't erase you." Her voice didn't come from her mouth. It came from everywhere. "That's why they need you." The tall being lifted a clawed hand and the room around me melted. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was nowhere. Or maybe between places. Images swirled, memories that weren't mine. Ancient temples, dark skies split by lightning, families kneeling before beings that shimmered like stars, rituals, agreements, exchanges. "We were never abducted," the girl said. "We were offered. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I just listened. Oh, your kind gave us to them long ago. You just don't remember." And then I understood. That night in the kitchen, wasn't an abduction. Itchy. It was a transaction, a continuation. And I wasn't the witness. I was the next participant. After that night, time became liquid. Days bled into each other. Dreams became indistinguishable from waking hours. And I started seeing people that weren't there. Or maybe they were. I began noticing them in crowds, faces slightly too smooth, expressions a beat too late, always watching, never blinking. At first, I avoided eye contact, but then I made a mistake. I followed one. It was an older man, or appeared to be. He wore a worn green jacket, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic pulsing at his wrist, like a circuit, but alive. I tailed him down the subway. He didn't look back once. He stepped into a maintenance tunnel I knew wasn't public. Still, I followed it. It led me nowhere, or at least nowhere on a map. The tunnel curved and narrowed, but never ended. There were no pipes, no rats, no light except the one ahead of him. And then he was gone. I turned to go back, but the tunnel had changed. Behind me, instead of the path I'd come from, stood 3 doorways, each one slightly ajar, each one humming softly. I didn't choose. The tunnel chose for me. I don't remember the journey. I only remember waking up in my old bedroom, the one I grew up in as a child. The posters were the same. The books stacked on the shelf were books I hadn't owned since I was 12. Outside, the neighborhood looked untouched by time. Mailbox dented the same way. That same golden retriever across the street barking at nothing. Tushits! But I wasn't a child. I looked in the mirror and saw myself. Older, weary, scared. Was this time travel? A replica? A punishment? I opened the closet. It was empty, except for one thing, a hooded robe hanging neatly, waiting. Beside it, a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside the envelope was a note. You returned. Most don't. That means you still have a choice. No signature, no explanation. That night, the shimmer returned, just as it always did, at 3:00. But this time, I stepped toward it willingly. I didn't resist. I didn't question. I passed through it, one slow step at a time. And the wall swallowed me whole. I woke up in a hallway. Not just any hallway, her hallway. I heard a voice in the room behind me, hers, laughing. The smell of dinner, the clink of silverware. I could hear myself, younger, laughing awkwardly. I was back to the night it all began. But I wasn't me. I was watching from the kitchen. And as I turned, I saw the shimmer appear again. And the 3 figures walked past me, leading her little sister toward the front door. They were maybe 4 foot tall, thin as hell, with long, skinny arms and weirdly long necks. They moved like they were used to doing this, silent and coordinated, and were wearing what appeared to be black skin-tight suits with no zippers, no seams, just smooth and tight over their whole bodies. Their heads were the size of melons, tilted slightly forward, like they didn't need to look up to know where they were going. I swear to God, this thing looked like a lizard in a hooded robe. Its face was brown and leathery and scaled. It didn't blink, but looked right at me as it passed. But I couldn't read its expression. The 3 of them, with her little sister in the middle, walked like she was in a trance. Went straight through the front wall of the house, like they weren't even solid. Everything hit me at once. I remembered every single detail like it had just happened. How they moved, the look of their skin, the shape of their bodies. I could feel the fear in my chest like a weight, and I shut up and told my girlfriend everything right away. And I know how this sounds, and I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I did, and I still remember exactly how it felt, too. Standing there completely frozen, more three inhuman things walked a little girl through a wall like it meant nothing. That moment never left me, and this time I understood the loop wasn't a prison. It was a gate, and I was the key. Story number 8. Some nights are uneventful. Others scratch at the edge of your memory like a dream that refuses to fade. This was one of those nights, the kind that makes you question your own senses and wonder if something out there is watching you back. I've never believed in the supernatural. I cook, I work, I sleep. That's it. But what happened that fall evening, it carved itself into my mind like a hot brand. And the strangest part, I wasn't scared at first. I was just curious. Maybe that was my first mistake. They say the mind plays tricks in the dark. But what do you do when the trick won't stop replaying? When you saw something so clearly, so undeniably, and no one believes you? I had the night off, rare in my line of work. Executive chef hours don't exactly leave room for spontaneity, but this evening was different. I'd had a couple drinks, passed out on the couch, and woke up with an unshakable craving for brownies. The kind you shouldn't eat at midnight, but crave anyway. The store nearby had already closed, so I grabbed my keys and headed across town to Walmart. It was quiet out. The kind of autumn night where the wind makes the leaves dance and your breath fogs up the window just a bit. I was 27 years old, living alone in my Riverview townhouse, working as an executive chef at a local restaurant. By the time I woke up, it was 9 a.m. Mid-fall, already dark outside. I was hungry, and brownies sounded amazing, but I didn't feel like making them. The closest grocery store had closed at 8, so I grabbed my keys and headed across town to Walmart, taking the expressway since it was the fastest route. I bought a box of brownies and a bunch of snacks I didn't need. It was 10 p.m. By the time I got back to my car, I rolled the window down, letting the cool air soothe the fog in my head. That's when something caught my eye. There, hovering just above the tree line to the north, a cluster of glowing orange spheres. They weren't blinking like plane lights, and they didn't move like helicopters or drones. They hung there, still and silent. I slowed down, squinting through the darkness. "Am I drunker than I thought?" I muttered. But I wasn't. I felt clear. The orbs didn't waver. They seemed observant. For a second, I rationalized it away. Maybe it was light reflecting off my window. I turned left toward my apartment, and then I stopped cold. Then it hit me. Maybe it was just the reflection of the orange highway lights on my driver's tractor window. But as I turned left towards my apartment, I froze. My driver's side window was already down. That was no reflection. I turned the car around, heart pounding just enough to make me sit up straighter. I wasn't about to be the guy who let a mystery float away. I headed back toward the stretch of road where I had seen them. Nothing. I drove slow, eyes darting between trees and sky, creeping along the shoulder like a hunter in his blind. Still nothing. Determined to prove myself wrong, I circled back, heading west on the expressway, slowly creeping along while peering out of the passenger window. Nothing. I did loops, west to east, east to west. Changed speeds, rolled the windows up, leaned forward, sat back. I tested every angle, every variable I could think of. I did this back and forth loop a few more times, changing my speed, rolling my window up and down, testing different angles, but the orbs were gone. Nothing. They were just gone. No sign, no glow, no hum, no proof. Back home, I couldn't sit still. I needed confirmation from someone, anyone. I called the local news station. No answer. Then the police station. Hey, I know this sounds a bit weird, but have you gotten any calls tonight about strange lights in the sky? Silence. Then with an audible eye roll, oh no, we haven't had any calls about lights in the sky. Of course, why would they? Time passed. I didn't forget the orbs, but I didn't talk about them either. What would I even say? That I saw a few orange lights and lost my mind? No thanks. But then I met Haley. She wasn't like the other women I dated. Smart, passionate, a little wild, and obsessed with aliens. Not in a cute, I watch sci-fi kind of way. She had folders, maps, theories, government cover-ups, hybrid experiments, you name it. One night, post-activity, we lay tangled in the dark, trading stories. She asked if I'd ever seen something I couldn't explain. I hesitated, then told her. I told her the story. She gave me a weird look. What? I asked. They aren't supposed to come that close to town. She said completely seriously. The way she said it, not like a joke, like a warning. I laughed it off, kind of, but it stuck with me. Because if they aren't supposed to come that close to town, then why did I see them? Story number 9. They say horses can sense things before we do, but nothing, no instinct, no training could have prepared us for what waited that night beyond the tree line. It didn't snarl, it didn't groan. It simply stood. And that silence, it screamed louder than any beast ever could. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't even a creature. It was a presence, something ancient, weightless, and yet impossibly heavy. My father once told me, if something doesn't belong in this world, the land will tell you. That night, the land didn't whisper. It roared. What I saw that night still visits me, not in dreams, but in every shadow tall enough to remind me of its impossible form. We had owned horses for generations. Storms, predators, break-ins, we'd faced them all. But that night, as we stepped out of the truck and into the dead silence of our pasture, we stepped into something else entirely. There was no wind, no moon, just a suffocating stillness, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. We parked the truck by the barn as usual, stepped out, and froze immediately. As just beyond the tree line, near one of the side paddocks, something huge stood up. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was vague in outline, shimmering faintly against the dark horizon, as if light struggled to touch it. A thin mist clung to its edges, blurring its form like a figure seen underwater. I blinked once. It was still there. My sister grabbed my arm. Neither of us said anything. Words felt useless, meaningless. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a horse. It was this massive light gray figure, vague in shape at first, but clearly solid, bigger than anything we'd expected to see out there. It should have lumbered like a bear or staggered like a wounded moose. But no, this thing moved with strange grace, inhuman, effortless, like gravity had less control over it. Wood. It covered 30 feet in what felt like 2 seconds. Not floating, but not quite running either. Its mass should have weighed it down, but instead, it surged forward like wind over ice. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from dissonance. My brain couldn't make sense of what it was seeing, like trying to solve a puzzle that kept changing shape mid-solution. It didn't belong here. And worse, it didn't act like it knew we existed. That was the scariest part. Then came the horses. A few seconds later, we heard a sudden eruption from the horses. The ones turned in that pasture absolutely lost their minds, screaming and panicking, full stampede mode towards the far fence line. No sound triggered them, no motion, just something. They ran like they were escaping death itself. I saw 2 of the mares collide, twist, recover, and keep sprinting without pause. These weren't mere prey instincts. This was existential dread, raw and ancient. One of the stallions reared back so violently he nearly flipped. My brother sprinted ahead to the paddock gate. He was yelling something, but it was swallowed by the chaos. We fumbled with flashlights, keys, fencing tools. Our usual nightly rhythm shattered. This was no routine check. We did a full count and double-checked, and every single one was accounted for. Nothing missing, no signs of injuries or blood, no damage to fencing or anything. Even as the panic died down, the air remained electric, like before a thunderstorm, except colder, empty. I stared toward the tree line where the thing had vanished. The night swallowed that place whole. No moon, no stars, just black. We never found any tracks or signs of what it was. We brought out floodlights the next morning, searched every inch. Hoof prints from the horses were everywhere, but nothing matched that creature. No deep indentations, no snapped branches, not even disturbed grass. It was like it had never touched the ground, like it was a ghost wearing skin. My grandfather, a Cherokee man who rarely spoke of old things, came out the following night. He didn't laugh or ask questions, just walked the paddock once, then poured a ring of ash around its border. He told us, "There's old weight here. Something walked wrong through your land." When we pressed, he said no more. Over the next few weeks, small things began happening. The barn cat, a fearless tabby, disappeared. 2 owls were found dead near the creek with no wounds on them. One of the horses, Angel, stopped eating. She'd stare at nothing, ears pinned flat, body tense. My mother started sleeping with a lantern lit by her window. My father set motion sensors, but they never triggered, even when we saw shadows outside. It wasn't just fear, it was presence, like the land remembered to I found myself dreaming of it, not the thing itself, but its bumping, that impossible speed, that silent gliding, that massive weight tied to no sound. Every time I dreamed, I saw the pasture, empty, still. Then suddenly, it moved, and I woke up sweating, heart thudding, ears ringing. I've never seen it again, and honestly, hope I never do. But sometimes, late at night, I'll take my flashlight and shine it toward that tree line. Not to check, but to make sure nothing's looking back. But I think it's still out there, not hiding, not hunting, just waiting. And next time, maybe it won't run. Maybe it'll come closer. Weeks turned into months. Spring came early that year, but the land felt reluctant, like it knew something had passed through and left a scar deep beneath the surface. One evening, I noticed something odd. Our most reliable mare refused to step onto the northern paddock. She planted her hooves and trembled, eyes locked on the far trees. She didn't bolt, didn't cry out. She simply stood, frozen, cut. I walked the fence line myself later that night. Beside, my flashlight flickered once, twice, and then held. As I reached the far corner, the wind shifted. It wasn't the scent of dirt or manure. It was colder, older, like the ground exhaled something buried long ago. The silence returned, too, that silence, the one that pressed on your ears like deep water. I held my breath without realizing it. My limbs went heavy. That's when I noticed the shape, not standing, not moving, just there, between two trees, taller than both, blending so perfectly with the night that I would have missed it, if not for the sheer wrongness of it. I didn't run, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't. My feet rooted themselves into the earth. My lungs refused to fill. It stared, not at me, not through me, but into something I didn't even understand existed within me. Then it moved, not away, not toward me, just sideways, like reality slipped and let it pass through. When I could breathe again, the shape was gone. I don't tell my family about that night. Some things are better left unsaid. Some truths are too heavy to carry together. But I did go back the next morning, and where it stood, I found something I hadn't expected. The grass had grown black, not burnt, not dead, just black, as if it had been replaced, as if the soil had chosen not to heal. I dug an inch down. The dirt crumbled dry like ash. I haven't touched that patch since. We put up new fencing, changed grazing patterns. No one asked why. But even now, as I sit and write this, the air outside the barn feels still again, too still. And somewhere beyond that paddock, I feel something waiting, not hunting, not moving, just existing, quietly, impossibly wrong. And if it ever decides to come back, I don't think it'll run this time. Story number 10. They say dreams are fiction born of the subconscious mind, but what if the dream follows you back into waking life? It happened in a house too old to breathe right, where shadows were thicker than dark, and the air held things it shouldn't. The night I saw the tall figure in the cloak was not a dream. I felt the floor beneath my feet. I smelled the staleness of death before I even understood it. He didn't need to speak. His silence screamed across the room, folding time into something unnatural. And when he touched me, the world vanished, but he never really left. The house stood like a memory carved into the edge of the woods, a place where time moved slow. The wood groaned with secrets, and silence felt heavier than sound. My great-grandparents had lived there since forever, it seemed, and everything inside smelled like forgotten decades, old curtains, cold steam, dust, thick like skin. I could think clearly. I could feel the hardwood floor under my feet, even smell the old air in the house, and feel my breath. That night, I wasn't dreaming in pictures. I was living it, step by step. The narrow hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the dim bulb overhead casting a muted yellow glow that didn't feel real. I stepped out of the room, walked down the narrow hall towards the living room, and then it is shifted, not violently, not suddenly, like a scene dissolving slowly but deliberately, the way mist lifts from the ground in the morning. It was the light that caught me first. The room wasn't dark, but the light wasn't normal either. It was a soft yellow glow like the ceiling light was on. But it didn't match the bulbs we always used. It was quiet, but not silent, like something was waiting. When I stepped into the living room, he was already there. He stood impossibly tall. His frame bowed slightly to fit the ceiling, as though this place wasn't built for him. The black cloak clung to him like a living shadow, swallowing the light around it. Flanking him were two shapes, indistinct and flickering, like sketches halfway erased. They seemed to flicker out the second I focused on them. Vague shapes, like something half erased or scrolled hastily into the background of the drawing. But the tall one, the cloaked one, was different, solid, present, wrong. He hadn't turned yet, but I already felt it. Time bent around him like heat over asphalt. He pivoted slowly, and in doing so, expanded. It didn't make sense. He gained height, space, weight. The room didn't grow smaller. He grew larger. His cloak ended at the height of a tall man. But when he turned around, I felt like he gained 2 extra feet. And when he turned toward, I felt everything change. The air itself, trembled, sound. I wanted to run. I couldn't. I wasn't even sure I was breathing anymore. He stared at me, and in that moment, my body froze. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. All I could register was the smell. Not rot, not blood, but decay, finality. The smell of something that has passed on, not recently, but long enough that the scent had turned quiet. His face was smooth and pale, no features outside the classic alien outline, a long, rounded head, slits where the nose should be, and a small mouth. But it was the eyes that shattered every sense of safety I had. Those weren't eyes meant for this world. They reflected nothing, absorbed everything. I don't think he blinked. He moved, deliberate and slow. One arm emerged from beneath the folds of his cloak. The fingers were too long, curling inward like branches reaching through frost-covered glass. From within his cloak, he reached out with one long, thin hand. His fingers curled like branches towards my bed, and then I collapsed into darkness. I woke up on the couch in the living room. It was just after dawn. I stood up, confused, and shuffled back to my bedroom, and as soon as I lay down, the memory of what had happened came back in full force. I didn't tell anyone. Not then, not for years. That morning, I watched my great-grandma cook breakfast while I sat at the table with shaking hands, staring into a glass of orange juice like it held answers. But the dreams began. Not vague nightmares, no symbols, no metaphors. I saw the tall one in them, always silent and always watching. Sometimes he was across the field by the tree line. Sometimes he stood in the hallway, just past the bathroom door, always still, always watching, never speaking. 2 years passed. My great-grandfather died. Something about his final days reminded me of the smell. It was the smell of death, nor rot, nor blood, but death. I didn't think I'd see him again, not outside the dreams, but one night I rose again for water, not because I was thirsty. I think I was being pulled. This time, it wasn't the smell. It was the feeling like gravity had tilted. I could feel my legs moving, but I couldn't stop. There was no fear, no king, only inevitability. He was already there. Same cloak, same silence. But this time, he wasn't shocked. He knew I'd come. There were no smaller ones, just him, and a sound, a low hum, like distant machinery vibrating through the bones of the house. He raised one long arm again, and the same thing happened. His hand touched me, and I lost consciousness. Again, I woke up on the couch, and again I was left with this lingering feeling of being watched. The dreams continued, sometimes once a month, sometimes every night, sometimes spaced by years. But always him. And always I woke in sweat, in fear, in silence. I tried to catch him once, sat in the living room in the middle of the night, wide awake, waiting. I never saw him. I remember nothing but stillness and a faint chill in the air. Yet I woke up sprawled awkwardly over the couch, like a puppet dropped mid-scene. Blankets tangled around my legs. No memory of sleep, only the feeling of having been seen. Who or what was he? I don't know what he is. I don't know why me, but I know what I saw. Hasa. I know the dreams aren't mine alone. That house, that place is not empty. It remembers, and so do I, because even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel that hand again reaching, and somewhere beyond what we understand, he is still waiting. Story number 11. There's something that only comes when my son sleeps beside me, and it never leaves a trace. I saw it, a hand, not human, not right, wrapped around my bedroom doorframe like it belonged there. It didn't run, it didn't hide. It moved like it owned the dark. The fever vanished. My son never stirred. But something had been there, something that touched nothing, yet left everything unsettled. I'm not afraid for me, but I'm his father, and I don't know if this thing is guarding him or claiming him. ever since he was little. Whenever my boy curls up beside me for the night, something strange happens. I'm a single dad. My son was born in 2010, and he's easily the most important thing in my life. There's a weight that comes with fatherhood, a quiet kind of promise you make when you hold your child for the first time. My boy, Nathan, he was never ordinary. I don't mean gifted or troubled. I mean, there's always been something else around him. I first noticed it when he was 5. He had nightmares, sure, like any kid. But I'd wake up and find things in odd places. His blanket folded when I hadn't moved, his stuffed bear propped under his arm just so. His door cracked open in that same slow arc every time. The dog would growl some nights, just once, low and uncertain. Not every night. Just when Nathan slept beside me, and it never felt threatening. It felt purposeful. Well, at times, I'm after a stormy night, I woke to find the window cracked open when I knew it was locked. The cold had crept into the room, but my son was warm and snoring. A nightlight unplugged and lying on the floor. Soft and deliberate sounds that pull me halfway out of sleep. Faint shadows or shapes in my peripheral vision. Why, I used to think I was just tired. That working shifts had scrambled my mind. But sleep deprivation doesn't leave handprints. Last night, Nathan had a fever. The kind that leaves you uneasy, like something's waiting on the other side of the silence. I let him sleep with me, like I always do when he's unwell. He kicked the blankets off, like he always does. Hates being hot. I remember glancing over at him just as I was starting to drift off. He'd kick off his blankets. He always does that. I'd try closing my eyes again, but something stirred. Not loud, not chaotic, just sharp. Enough to pull me out of whatever dream I was falling into. I sat up. Something felt off. That's when I noticed my bedroom door was open. I never leave it open. That door is my ritual. I shut it every night, sometimes without even thinking. So when I saw it ajar, my gut coiled. Then I saw the hand, not a full figure, just 4 long, pale fingers curled around the edge of the frame, unmoving, no noise, no breath. But they weren't human. Too long, too smooth, like something imitating us poorly. The shape was unmistakable, but not human. I moved without thought. Legs off the bed, and in a blink, the hand withdrew, slipping out of sight with unnatural grace. No rush, no stumble. A shadow, trailing behind it, a tail maybe slid down the hallway. I followed fast. No lights turned on. I didn't dare wake Nathan, but the hall was empty. The whole house was empty, or it was supposed to be. The windows were locked, the doors untouched. Even the back latch I often forget, still sealed. Nothing broken, nothing moved, but everything wrong. When I returned to the bedroom, Nathan was still there, peaceful, blankets tucked up to his chest, pillow perfectly beneath his head, and his fever gone. His breathing was even and deep, and when I touched his forehead, the fever he had earlier was gone, like it had never been there at all. I stood there, silent. Something hovered in the room, not a presence, not dread. It was like something had just left, a space still cooling from where it had stood. The dogs hadn't stirred, not a growl, not even a twitch. That terrified me more than the hand. They sleep in my room every night, and neither of them barked, growled, or even twitched. If it could pass by them unnoticed, it wasn't bound by the normal rules. It came and went with purpose, quiet, efficient, like it knew exactly what it wanted. I'm not sure what that is, but I know it's tied to my son. It never comes for me. It never threatens. It just shows up when he's here, and only then. It's not just this one time. There have been other nights. Always the same calm presence. Never violent, but deliberate. One night during a bad snowstorm, I woke to find his humidifiers humming softly. I hadn't turned it on, and yet there it was, mist curling gently into the cold air. His plush rabbit nestled in the crook of his arm like someone had tucked it in. Still, he never stirred. I've questioned myself 1,000 times. Maybe I'm broken in some way. Maybe I want to believe in patterns because fatherhood demands constant vigilance. But no theory explains what I feel. This thing, it doesn't just visit. It intervenes, like it's watching over him, or worse, claiming him. There's a difference, and it haunts me that I don't know which it is. I've talked to no one about this. Friends wouldn't understand. Therapists would want sleep studies, but none of that changes what I see. Every time Nathan shares my bed, this thing comes. Sometimes it shifts objects. Sometimes it appears. But always, it leaves him better, like it healed something, corrected some imbalance. That hand, it wasn't reaching for me. It was observing, and I keep coming back to the same question. Why does it only happen when my son sleeps beside me? Maybe it's tied to him. Maybe it's always been. I'm not afraid of the dark anymore. I'm afraid of what might love my son more than I do. Some things don't begin in the moment they arrive. They begin long before, quiet, unnoticed, waiting for their time. Before Nathan was born, his mother used to say she dreamed of a figure watching us. At the time, I thought it was just anxiety. Pregnancy does that to people. But she described the same silhouette again and again. Tall, narrow, gentle he saw hands with too many joints and an eye that never blinked. She said it never frightened her. It only stood near the nursery window, watching. I brushed it off, even joked about it. Great, free babysitter, I'd said once. She didn't laugh. Then, during labor, things went wrong. Nathan's heart rate dropped. Doctors flooded the room. Panic, worries, noise, and then stillness. A moment of unnatural quiet in the chaos. Every machine reset. Her vitals stabilized. Nathan's heartbeat returned. The doctors called it luck. A fluke, a recovery unexplained, but welcome. Later, she whispered to me, it was there. She died 3 months after giving birth. Postpartum heart failure. They called it unexpected, quick, unfair. That night, Nathan didn't cry once. He slept with a faint smile on his face, and I thought someone was with him. I never spoke of her dreams again. But sometimes I wonder if the thing she saw never left. 2 weeks ago, I decided to test it. I needed to know if this entity would appear again. So I staged the night, I told Nathan he could sleep beside me again. I made it as close to those previous nights as possible. Same pillow, same pajamas, same humidifier, but I added something new. I placed salt under the windows as a warding gesture I'd read about. I rigged a motion trigger camera near the hallway door. I left his plush bear just a little out of reach to see if it would be repositioned. Then I waited. Nathan drifted off fast, feverless this time. Peaceful. Around 3:30 a.m., the hallway light flickered for a second. Not out, just a dim pulse. The camera didn't trigger. The salt? Untouched. But I felt it. Something shifted in the room. A presence. Not wind, not weight, but certainty. It was here. I lay completely still, pretending to sleep, my ears strained, and then I felt something cold and gentle brush past my ankle. Not rough, not sharp. It was deliberate. I opened my eyes just enough. There it was again. The hand. But this time, I saw more. It was tall, not massive, but taller than me by at least a foot. Thin. Limbs like willow branches. No face, just a smooth, slightly glowing shape where features should have been. It stood by Nathan's side, its head tilted, and then it tucked his plush bear under his arm. I swear to you, it adjusted the covers, then turned to me. Not fast, not aggressive, just acknowledgement. I blinked, and it was gone, just like that. No sound, no camera trigger, nothing. But the bear had moved. That morning, Nathan woke up smiling. "Daddy," he said, "the tall man made my dreams better." I froze. "What tall man?" He shrugged like it was obvious. "The one who comes when I'm sick. He tells me not to be afraid." "What does he look like?" Nathan thought. "He has no mouth, but he..." I didn't press more. I didn't want to frighten him, but the words sat in my chest like a stone. I've lived through fear. I've lived through grief, but this strange benevolence, I can't categorize. The thing hasn't hurt us. If anything, it's protected Nathan. But protection has a price. It always does. What does it want? I still don't know. But I've stopped trying to trap it. I've stopped calling it a threat. Now, every night Nathan sleeps beside me, I sleep lighter, and every time I feel that hush in the room, that watchful calm, I whisper one quiet plea into the dark. Please, just keep him safe. A few nights after the trap night, Nathan woke up crying. Not from fear, from pain. He clutched his arm, right near the elbow, saying it itched deep inside. I rolled up his pajama sleeve and saw something new, a thin spiraling mark just beneath the skin, barely visible under the soft lamplight. It looked like a spiral, or maybe a fingerprint. There was no bruise, no swelling, just that faint symbol, like it had always been there, but only now chose to show itself. I took him to a pediatrician. The doctor dismissed it as a birthmark we'd never noticed before. Said it was nothing to worry about, but it wasn't there a week ago. That night, Nathan didn't sleep beside me. I needed space to think. Nothing happened. No sounds. No door opening. Just silence. But at 3:45 a.m., the hallway light turned on just a flicker, enough to make me sit upright. There was no hand, no shadow, no tall figure. But on the wall opposite my door, drawn in faint, perfect lines of dust, was the same spiral. It hadn't come into the room. It had just left a message. I'm not a superstitious man, but I've read enough, seen enough, and felt enough to know that something beyond me is at work here. I've started journaling every night, and Nathan sleeps beside me, trying to trace patterns, signals. Shush. Here's what I've learned. The presence never appears if Nathan sleeps alone. It's calm, not aggressive, surgical in its movements. Every time it visits, Nathan wakes healthier, stronger. It never touches me, but it knows I see it. The dogs never react. It responds when challenged, but only subtly. The mark on his arm faded after 5 days, but sometimes in certain light, I can still see it. I don't think it's gone. I think it's waiting. Maybe it's something old, older than any myth or ghost story. A guardian, perhaps, or a keeper, not bound by kindness or malice, but by some pact I'll never understand. And Nathan? He says the tall man tells him stories and dreams, stories about stars and lost places and other children. Are there other kids he watches over? I asked him once. Yes. Nathan nodded. But not all of them have daddies that see. I've stopped asking who the tall man is. Now, I only ask myself one thing. What happens when Nathan grows up and sleeps alone forever? Will the figure vanish, or will it follow? Story number 12. Have you ever seen something so impossible, so wildly outside the framework of science, that your entire worldview shattered in a heartbeat? They say reality is fixed, explainable, measurable, until it's not. Until it folds in on itself like a dream you can't wake from. I used to believe every word the experts said. Science was my religion, and skepticism my only ritual. But then a floating orb in the sky looked me in the eye. It didn't blink. It didn't need to. Because it knew that from that moment, nothing would ever be the same for me again. This isn't a story about aliens. It's a story about belief, about surrendering the arrogance of certainty, and what happens when the universe whispers, "You know nothing." I used to be all in on the mainstream scientific approach to everything. If Richard Dawkins said it, it was gospel. If Neil deGrasse Tyson had an opinion, I echoed it without question. My curiosity and critical thinking were on autopilot. I was a lemming, blindly following the voices of authority in science. My days were ordered, predictable. I worked in a clinical lab running data simulations, my life governed by graphs and algorithms. The world made sense when it could be measured. That was my armor. That was my religion. Then, on an otherwise ordinary August afternoon, something slipped through that armor. Dude, Massachusetts was heavy that day, not just from heat, but from the yellowish smog that drifted in from fires up north. My friend Giovanni and I had just returned from a hike and were approaching my back patio. We weren't talking about anything deep, just joking about dinner, when he grabbed my arm tightly. "There," he said, pointing. I followed his gaze, not expecting anything more than a squirrel or maybe a drone. But just above the trees, hovering with eerie stillness, was a black orb. No bigger than a basketball, yet it felt colossal somehow. Then one day, something happened, and from that moment forward, the world started to get stranger. It wasn't just black, it shimmered, with oily brown and violet hues that shifted as it moved. The surface seemed semi-liquid, pulsing like it was breathing. What truly shattered my composure was the air around it, warped and fluid, like the space itself was giving way to this thing, like it was a stone dropped into the pool of our universe. It was black, but had this strange brownish-purple sheen, almost like oil onto water, and it floated like a bubble. It wasn't random. The object adjusted its path for every obstacle. It glided over the power line, dipped under tree branches, paused near my neighbor's chimney as if scanning, then continued on its calculated, haunting route. It wasn't just drifting aimlessly either. It had intent. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared, but because I was undone. Something intelligent had crossed our backyard, and it didn't care what I thought it was. My skepticism didn't die that day. It didn't surrender overnight. But cracks had formed, small, silent fractures in the marble of my certainty. A few months later, I moved out of state for work. That's when the weirdness escalated. One evening, I was home alone, unloading groceries. As I passed through the hallway, I saw the baby gate swing shut, not fast, gently, as though someone closed it carefully. There was no breeze, no pet. I froze, not in terror, but in confusion. Then I saw it, a grayish, smoky hand, not attached to anything, retreating as the gate clicked into place. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. Who would believe me? I moved to another state, and that's when the truly unexplainable started happening. I watched as a baby gate shut itself. A grayish, shadowy hand pushed it closed, though no one else was there. But then my wife started noticing things too. Cold pockets of air in our bedroom, a voice she couldn't place, and finally, the UFO. We were driving through the Blue Ridge Mountains at night, the kids asleep in the back seat, when it appeared. A second orb, not black this time, but brilliant white, pulsating like a heartbeat. It floated parallel to our car for almost a full mile before shooting upward and vanishing. I saw another UFO, this time with my wife and kids beside me. That was the moment I stopped resisting. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't hysteria. Something was reaching out again and again to us, as if to say, pay attention. And then came the surgery. A routine operation went sideways. I lost too much blood, my vitals crashed, and I died. Then I had a near-death experience. After waking from surgery, my blood pressure plummeted and my heart stopped. What came next wasn't a tunnel, nor a voice, nor any of the cliches you've heard. It was understanding, not with words, not with visuals, but with knowing. I felt the whole universe like a single breath. I saw everyone I had ever loved and ever would, wrapped in a fabric of connection I cannot name. In that moment, I experienced something I can't fully put into words. A light, an overwhelming sense of love, a complete understanding of everything. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real. When I returned, something had changed. My sense of time, my priorities, my perception of coincidence, all rewired per kid. Story number 13. You ever felt like your memory was playing tricks on you? Not because you're getting old, but because the truth was too strange to hold on to? There's a certain summer I can barely recall, not because it wasn't special, but because something about it refused to be remembered. I was 12, fresh out of primary school, when my friends and I stumbled on something that should have changed us. But none of us ever talked about it again. It didn't make sense back then. And now, after all these years, it makes even less. All I can do now is tell you what I saw, what we all saw, before it turned into something we were told it never was. During the summer of 2011, having just graduated primary school, my 6 friends and I ventured almost every day to the exact same place along the outskirts of town. It was our secret kingdom, tucked beyond the football pitch and past a rundown fence with more gaps than structure. No parents, no rules. Just a patch of wild grass and a few gnarled trees that leaned like they had secrets. We spent hours there, climbing trees until our arms were scratched raw, playing tag through brambles like warriors in a fantasy realm. Some days we declared war on imaginary armies, as other days we just lay in the grass, staring up, waiting for clouds to morph into dragons or pirates. But there was something else, something no one but us cared about. A creek barely 4 feet across ran like a hidden vein between our field and the rugby club. It wasn't deep, but it was tricky. We found a rotten plank and balanced it like acrobats. We dared each other to jump it. Being the attention seeker I was at that age, I was always willing to jump up and over to the other side. In fact, I was the best at it. Almost anyone else who tried mostly ended up with 1 foot in less than sanitary water. We called that side the Forbidden Grounds, even though all it led to was a stretch of grass beside the rugby field. But for 12-year-olds with no smartphones and too much imagination, it might as well have been another dimension. Then school came, and life slowed. Several months later, however, and nearly halfway through our first year at secondary school, our tradition of jumping creeks and field hide-and-seek had sadly become far less frequent. We still hung out, just not there. That place began to feel like a ghost of summer, until one afternoon, everything came rushing back. So we went back, not sure why. Maybe nostalgia, maybe boredom. My friends and I ventured back to our den in the nearby creek, crossing over and entering behind the grounds of the rugby club. The field was still there, unchanged, though the trees seemed more skeletal in the autumn breeze. We were restless, so we wandered. Some of us kicked at rocks. George tried skimming stones along the edge of the creek. I was halfway through telling some dumb joke when someone stopped walking. "There," someone whispered, pointing up. We all turned. There was something in the sky. It wasn't that high, maybe a couple 100 feet above us. It moved slowly, deliberately, not in a straight line like a commercial plane, not zigzagging like a bird. It hovered, circled, came closer. And at first, we assumed it was just a military craft. We'd seen them before. RAF jets flew over town sometimes, especially during the festivals. But this thing looked different. The wings were wrong, too flat. The body too round. And it had no tail. the closer this thing got. However, the more it started to look like something else, something that none of us had probably ever seen. "Is that a—" someone started. I didn't let them finish. I knew what they were thinking because I was thinking it too. It looked like a UFO. Whatever this thing was, it was still coming our way and flying curiously low. We stood, frozen, staring upward as it passed above us. The oddest part? It made no sound. None, not even the hum of distant engines. That's when I heard it. "Crap," someone muttered behind me, and by the time I look behind me, all I see is every one of my friends running away towards the embankment of the creek, like they knew it was coming for us. Only George and I stood our ground. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe we were just too stunned to move. I'm sure I thought of running, too, but I must have been in such a disbelief at what I was seeing. George whispered, "Don't move." Not like a command, more like a prayer. The object was right above us now. I swear I could see panels on the underside, hexagonal plates that shimmered like oil in sunlight. No cockpit, no insignia, just this impossibly smooth surface, hovering as if gravity didn't apply. And even if I did run, I thought it was sure to abduct me. Whether I ran or stood right where I was, I felt convinced there was nothing I could really do. If it was going to take me, it would. I tried to make sense of it, tried to tell myself it had to be a drone or something normal. But there was nothing normal about it. Then it shifted, not disappeared, not turned, just shifted. It was as if the air around it bent and curled, and suddenly the shape wasn't the same anymore. What had once been a disc now resembled something closer to a delta wing. Still silent, still too low. It turned slightly, angled away from us, and began moving off. What I see instead is some kind of low-flying military jet turned slightly away from us now and flying off. Just like that, the spell broke. Our friends returned from the creek bank, looking sheepish, confused, relieved. My friends also must have noticed it was just a military jet as they stopped running and now joined slowly back with the rest of the group, realizing there was nothing to be afraid of. Someone muttered, "Just a jet." Someone else tried to laugh, but no one really did. Although my memory of the following conversation is hazy, we did discuss what we had just seen. But even that was brief. We never really broke it down, never tried to explain what happened, as if talking about it too much might pull it back. We left the rugby grounds, walked back toward town, and played football at the park like nothing had happened. But something had. We all knew it. We just didn't know what to do with it. And here's the weirdest part. Not a single one of us ever talked about the experience again. Not even for a laugh. We were 12. Maybe we were scared. Maybe we convinced ourselves it didn't matter. Time went on. We drifted. I did drift away from most of these friends by the following year as we all separated classes in school and played for rival football teams. Kai and I reconnected a year later during drama class. We performed urban legends on stage, got obsessed with scary stories online, hunted down spooky documentaries, but in that same year, enjoying being scared together, not once to my recollection did either of us bring up that recollection of the rugby club. We sought out fear, but not that one. That one stayed buried and I forgot about it. Genuinely, it slipped from my mind for nearly 10 years. Until recently, falling down the rabbit hole of UFO lore and sightings brought the memory back like a punch to the gut. That day, the object's shape, the lack of sound, the altitude, none of it made sense. Some things about that day no longer add up to me. First, the noise, or the lack of it. From what I've read and witnessed since then, RAF jets at only 25 millers after takeoff are so loud it can even rupture your eardrums. That thing was flying barely above rooftop level. We heard nothing but each other. Second, the transformation. I swear, it changed shape mid-air, morphing like light bending around a corner. I did come across one video. A spinning bright yellow light in the sky that slowly morphed into a standard airliner. Was it the same phenomenon? When I previously shared my experiences online, one person suggested it could have been the Avro Vulcan VH5, a bizarre-looking craft based near my hometown in 20. I looked it up. The wingspan, the silhouette, it was close, but not quite. That thing didn't shimmer. It didn't bend the sky. Still searching for closure, I emailed a local UFO investigator focused on Yorkshire. He replied quickly, asked for a phone call. During the call, I laid it all out. The low flight, the shape, the silence. He paused, then said, "That was not a military craft, and that was it."